So thank you all for really, really interesting talks. Something for the room that I noticed yesterday prepping for this session is that we have a really, really good mix of public sector, NGO, international speakers. We've got academia and we've got consultancy on the table. So I'd like to set this session off actually asking about the values, and I said to Kate that I'd bring this back in. I'm going to bring that ship back round. The ship hasn't sailed. What do we think is the biggest opportunity for valuing ecology with biodiversity conservation? And yeah, I'd like to hear from the room, the group, and hear from the different areas that you work in, what you think about that.
Who wants to go? Yeah, go.
I'll go first. I think my answer today is different than it would have been 6 months ago. I was at the World Ocean Summit in Tokyo in March, and the head of oceans from the World Economic Forum got up on stage and said, nobody's going to invest in conservation for conservation's sake because there's no return on investment. And that was really fascinating for me. And one of the things I think is really interesting is how we can make nature restoration not only meet our nature goals, which it needs to, but also look at how we can design it in a way so that companies and developers can access sustainable finance at cheaper rates of interest. And when you talk about building a business case, there's something about how do you make existing activity, how do you build the business case for them such that they are hitting nature goals and able to access finance at cheaper interest rates. And that's the business case, because it's not the business case for nature, it's the business case for the operator who's going to be operating anyway. But building an overhead for nature into that. And I think that much more policy and science and finance need to come closer together, because we're building international frameworks that sit separately and they need to sit together. So that's, yeah, I think.
Can I?
Yeah.
It's a very difficult topic, I think, and it's what I said before. Like it's something that can be used as a tool, but it's also something that can be. It's risky to use it, because if you start to value something, then it becomes a trading tool, right?
Yeah. I agree with you on natural capital, and I guess I'm not saying that you put a value on nature. I too think that's really, really risky. I think it's about looking at the finance flows that developers need to fund their activity, and how do you make that cheaper for them? And that's not about putting a value on nature, but it is about saying, within that sustainable finance framework, you need to provide assurance that your nature restoration is happening.
Right.
Rather than, I agree, putting a value on a pound sign on nature is very risky.
Mm-hmm. What we have been advocating for is for all the marine users to put a certain percentage of what it's worth into a nature regeneration or nature restoration fund. And if you look at offshore wind, I mean, it's millions, billions of euros, dollars, pounds, whatever. If you use 1 to 5% of that amount, there's so much you could do with that money. But there also needs to be the space for it. And I think that's also something that policy right now is lacking. I mean, we have the marine protected areas, but they're just paper parks where nothing is actually protected. And then if we get to the point where there's an actual protected area that is also protected, it has to be managed as well. And that's still definitely an issue.
Yeah. I was going to say there needs to be the space for it, but there also needs to be the objective set. And, you know, you can't just throw money at a problem and it's going to go away. You need to have specific set objectives, and these need to be led strategically by government to find the right space, the right place, and the right objectives and the right conservation measures to bring these things forward as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it needs to be led strategically.
Yeah. Is that an answer to your question?
It does, yes, thank you. Does anybody else want to add anything to that before I move to the room? No. Do we have any questions in the room? Yeah, if we go...
Where was first?
Okay, yeah, we'll go over to Mario first.
Thanks. Ben Williams from RWE, and it's sort of, Dickon sort of answered my question in a way, I think. I just wanted to add a bit of context. I think when we're in the room of generally like-minded people, it's easy to forget real context of the world that we're operating in, and that is, at the moment, offshore wind might be billions, but it's a very, very difficult industry at the moment. We see auctions struggling all over the world. We see projects getting cancelled. Nature-inclusive design, I've often hear developers have to design nature into their projects. That adds complexity and cost at every stage of the development, right the way through to decommissioning as well. We've got conflicting views in the room about, is it good, is it bad, should we be introducing it, should we not? Again, complexity. And the danger is we've seen projects cancelled, as I say, and we won't roll out offshore wind, and we'll miss our climate targets, and climate change, probably the biggest risk to biodiversity globally, will overtake us. So we need to remember all of these things, that we're great work that people are doing, the context that it has to exist in. That at the moment offshore is really difficult. I think the points that Dickon made about accessing better finance for these projects through the added value that you can add in other areas is really important. So yeah, you beat me to the question, Dickon, but just a bit of context, I think, for the room. Thanks.
And if I could just add to what Ben's saying, we've had conversations with the investment teams at NatWest and at Barclays, and their sustainable finance teams are investing terrestrially because they're the assurance and accreditation frameworks available for them, and those aren't available offshore, so they can't invest offshore. And it's those accreditation assurance frameworks and the science that we've been monitoring, we've been talking about here, that will allow that to happen. And the other thing is really important, we talked about this the other day, Ben, is moving that requirement to deliver as far up the project pipeline as possible. So if you can do that at a leasing or planning stage rather than a project stage, you're removing a whole load of uncertainty from the financial gateways that people like Ben have to go through.
Can I add something? Yeah, and it actually comes back to what Stephen's talk was about. You had the slide of restorative, nature-inclusive design and these creative solutions. And I would just sort of urge developers in offshore wind as well to make sure that alongside the creative solutions that you are working with the restorative. Mm-hmm. So what is, maybe JNCC or NatureScott have said, established that it's important to restore and recover naturally, that you're working with that as well, that they're not separate actually, there should be little arrows between those, and hopefully that what you're doing is complementing and not distinct and separate from it.
Yeah. Questions online? Yeah, we've got a question online.
We have a question from Bethany Wills, DEFRA, I believe. It's for Leanne. It's a short question, maybe a big answer, I don't know. Are wrecks or could shipwrecks be considered as OECMs?
That's a perfect question. I haven't recently checked the OECM database. There may be ones that are listed as such, provided they're as clean as they possibly can. Yes is the answer. I mean, if a maple tree forest behind a campus can meet those criteria, absolutely. And I would urge people to put case forward. We could really surpass that 30% target once we start adding up. Even a small footprint of a platform will add up. And I would argue strongly that in many cases OECMs are far more effective than certain MPAs. So yes, please look at your shipwreck carefully.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Hi, Rebecca from the University of Aberdeen. Listening to all of these talks, it almost sounds like what we're currently doing is hoovering a carpet in a derelict castle where the roof is crumbling. Does it make sense, or is this something that should be done where everyone who uses the North Sea or whatever ocean we're talking about gets together and designs what it should be looking like to be an ecosystem that is thriving and functioning? And obviously we can't, or we won't stop using the ocean. We won't give up fisheries. We won't stop trying to harness energy in a sustainable manner. So is that something we should be doing, or is that something being talked about?
If I could just jump in, I think marine spatial planning has a lot to answer for that. I think we've got a good national, at least in Scotland, an excellent national marine spatial plan. The North Sea countries all have fantastic. Some are transboundary. We don't have so many regional marine spatial plans. I'm not sure to what extent we've integrated these sorts of conversations in our marine spatial plans, where we're supposed to, inclusively and participatory in a way, come together to set our objectives and what is our vision for the North Sea, and therefore what do we need to do to get there. I don't think we've integrated these conversations yet in that. So that would just be my one mechanism. I think we really need to work harder with our marine spatial planners to get these things in.
Yeah, and there are initiatives like the GNSPI that try to look on a sea basin scale, but basically all of the member states, European member states, but also UK, at first it's a national thing, right? And then you start to look beyond the border, and then you see that maybe it doesn't match up. So I think in some ways we're already a little bit late. But it's never too late to start working together, right? So, and I think those initiatives that are forming can really help with having, one vision for the future. But it's difficult because there are so many different opinions and so many different wishes and policies as well that make aligning difficult.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's all well and good thinking we can have one aim and one vision for the future, but there's so many different cooks in the kitchen with different opinions on what that future looks like to come up with that one strategic aim. It's really difficult.
Just to add to that, the short answer to the question is yes, that absolutely should be happening. So I would speak from an English perspective. In England, that understanding about what the capacity is of our seas is mainly being driven by the Crown Estate alongside the MMO. The Crown Estate's seabed owners are responsible for rolling out future offshore wind and reaching those targets. They understand that to reach those targets is really, really hard. And they're moving from a process of going individual lease round to individual lease round, which is difficult to do, to a process where they're actually going, well, what does that 2050 target look like? How do we break that up into rounds over the next 15 years? And how do we roll that out in a way that meets our net zero targets, doesn't stop us meeting our biodiversity targets, and doesn't put the fishing industry out of business? Because those are the three things they really want to think about. Just as an aside, last week, the week before, we were with the EcoWind PIs in the Crown Estate, talking to them about how we take their static GIS-based planning tool and add in complex ecosystem dynamics on top of it. And that's a really difficult thing to do, because it's not just about data layers, it's about science advice and technical expertise that sits alongside those static layers. Those conversations are starting to happen. It's probably a decade too late, to be honest, but they are starting to happen. And I think what you're finding is that, what I'm finding anyway, is that the government community are much more open to bringing in the research community to those conversations than they ever have been. So I would just encourage all of you who do work in the research community, take those opportunities when they arise, respond to consultations. Certainly when the research programs that we work in, we're trying to facilitate that as much as possible.
Do you want to add anything to that, Stephen?
Yeah, I would just add there is a lot of work in collaboration. So the Great North Sea Basin Initiative, for example, OSPAR, the North East Atlantic Strategy 2030, the Benthic Regional Action Plan, UK and Norway leading on that. So there is a lot of, regional, countries pooling resources, putting forward kind of what they want, what the outcomes, what needs to be done, what is targets. So yeah, and in scientific communities, ICs, similar, there's huge collaboration. I think everyone wants the same outcomes, everyone wants a positive outcome. So.
Yeah, definitely. Working together is definitely the way forward. We've got lots of questions in the room. Do we have any more online before I go to the room? No? Okay. So I'll take one at the back.
Hi, my name is Jess. I work with McDonald. In full disclosure, I previously worked with the MNG team in Natural England. So my question is for Dickon. Obviously, I know the sensitivity of M&G development, so I'm not going to draw you on any detail, but I was just wondering if there was going to be any mention or consideration of nature-inclusive design and or decommissioning in the publication that is hoping to be published in a month's time about the assessment framework, or is that something that's going to come in later M&G development phases? Thank you.
Hi, Jess. I didn't see you back there. Yes, so the answer is yes. So there are, as I said, there are 3 reports that are coming out, one looking at restoration potential, one looking at an assessment framework, which is effectively the delivery framework for net gain offshore, and one looking at different delivery mechanisms for net gain. And in that one looking at different delivery mechanisms for net gain, we are looking at things that previously wouldn't be talked about. So whether you can consider whole site management of an MPA as a nature positive measure, can we do fisheries management, and what does that mean for the fisheries community, and how do you subsidise them in the most effective way? Can you use decommissioning, and what are the things that are holding up decommissioning? My understanding is that report and some of the areas that we're looking at in there, we're not providing answers, but we are saying these are a set of challenges. If you want to use these as a measure, then these are the things you're going to need to consider. And hopefully over the next 12 to 18 months, we'll be taking those and building them out. I was talking to someone yesterday. From my view, I think that the discussion around decommissioning is going to get much more driven in a UK context from offshore wind than it is from oil and gas. And it's around that nature-inclusive design, nature-positive space.
Thanks, Dickham. Yeah, if we go, can you get to the middle? To the middle of the room.
Paul Kirk from Orsted. A lot of the talks, I think Dick and yours and Aline yours sort of mentioned absolute baselines, shifting baselines, and I think we sort of talked about not looking backwards but looking forwards. But is there a need to kind of maybe think about what the North Sea, was historically, and are we doing that properly? Could we start to think about trying to understand what nature could do if it was left alone, and are there mechanisms for doing that? So thinking about the Marine Recovery Fund, for example, could that be used to create, and I think Stephen's talk mentioned it, sort of holding the horses on nature inclusive design, but taking a step back and understanding what nature could do if we did remove all anthropogenic activity. Could something like the Marine Recovery Fund be used to do that and properly monitor it? Because I think that always seems to be a barrier. We talked about paper parks, could we actually designate something and remove all of those anthropogenic pressures and then actually properly monitor it and understand what nature would do if it was left to its own devices?
Yes. I mean, that's why marine protected areas that are actually protected are so important, right? We don't know what exactly would happen. If we take the native oyster, for example, because we fished them out, they probably wouldn't return by themselves. So what would happen in such a, if you would take the same amount of area that used to be a natural reef and just, put a fence around it and see what happens, I don't think it would go back to the state it was before, because we're in a different stable state right now that you would need active actions if you want to go back to that. That doesn't mean that if you would do something like that the nature that would develop there is not valuable whatsoever. And I think we need more spaces like that where we just let it be and let it grow. And I think looking back would give us an idea of what the system could look like. But having, changed it so much with climate change coming over it as well, there's going to be different species. The community is going to look completely different. But that might be okay. And that is also something that we have to think about, both in policy and in science. What do we think is okay? What can it look like? And are we aiming for specific targets within species or species groups or habitats? And when are we happy with that? So that's a question I can't answer, but it's something to think about. Yeah.
Just to build on what Lynn was saying, I think that starts with national and regional status assessment. So you could talk about nature positive operations and nature inclusive design and talk about individual kind of targets. But if those aren't aligning with what that, we talked about a national vision and what our national targets are, then actually it's going to be quite difficult, not just to get traction, but to get lots of disparate parts of the community, whether they're developers or NGOs, all working in the same direction. So I think having aspirational but deliverable good environmental status descriptors and targets, and that's the place that we should be setting what we want our seas to look like, and then everybody working towards it. That's a challenging thing. I haven't looked at the consultation assessment, the consultation of the recent status assessment that's live. But if you are looking at that and you're responding to that consultation, have a think about what's the status of the seas that you want. And when we're looking at targets and descriptors, are we just going back to the 1980s, or are we going back to the 1800s, or are we looking forward to the 2100s? There was a really interesting piece of work done by Anna Kiros in Plymouth, where she looked at the recent highly protected marine areas that were designated last year in the UK, and said that actually if they'd used their climate change models, they might have put them in different places because they aren't going to be climate refuge here in 100 years. And that's really, really, really important that we understand that.
I would just like to add on the challenge of monitoring, and you say like having these restored areas and you're going to go back and see them, but I think we have to be realistic of how much we can monitor of the UK sea area. It's 3.5 times the land area of the UK. There's so many weeks of monitoring a year. You know, if you take the pressure away and you're assuming restoration, are you going to make the effort to monitor something when you are maybe going to want to look at where the pressures are impacting the environment, where that might be adverse effects? So, you know, there's a lot of discussion of what would recovery look like, how long would recovery take? Do we assume if the pressure's removed that we will have recovery? And yeah, I suppose being realistic about, you know, just how much resource there is to measure that at a UK scale, you know, a regional scale.
Yeah, I think that goes for pretty much all of the North Sea countries as well. It's very, yeah, you can't know everything.
No.
The more we know, the more we don't know, or we know we don't know. And I think it's a similar discussion with if you go beyond mitigation towards compensation and offsetting, like what is true compensation? I think that's a really, really difficult discussion to have. Is it even possible to have true compensation from, you know, a marine structure that you're building or placing somewhere? And also with the offsetting, I mean, what counts and what are we working towards? So yeah, lots to think about.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two more short questions in the room. We've got one online. No, you've not got one online. Okay, so we'll go to somewhere in the room. Yes, we'll go to the back with Debbie. Thank you, Mario.
This is a little bit, Debbie Russell, SIME Research Unit, University of St Andrews. I think in terms of, there's some trickiness in terms of the biodiversity aspect, and I guess this goes back to Stephen's point in terms of what people want to see, but also how things like keystone species are impacted. So, for example, a lot of these areas where wind farms are going are sandbanks that, you know, are really important sand eel habitats, and sand eels, you know, are clear, you know, very important species. And so I guess I was just wondering the panel's thoughts on, you know, is what do we want to see in 100 years' time? But actually, how do we communicate and how do scientists kind of show, well, what will it look like in 100 years' time if you do X, Y, Z, right? And the importance of not just kind of these biodiversity measures, but also kind of how these things are impacted. It's not really, I don't really know if it's a question, but
It's a really good question, Debbie, and it's actually something we were talking about with the Crown Estate a couple of weeks ago. There needs to be an interaction between people in government who are doing marine planning and the research community. You guys understand the complexity of our marine environment from primary production all the way up to those keystone predators, and how the physical, biological and chemical environments are interacting over time and how that's interacting with climate change. Communicating that well to the government community based upon scenarios and questions that they're developing is going to be really important. And there's a difference between producing excellent peer-reviewed papers and good data sets and providing timely and meaningful science advice. And we as a community need to get better at doing that, I think, because it's the science advice aspect of it that's really, really important. And the other thing I would say is that those decisions are happening very fast. And so understanding how we can get the expertise that's sat in rooms like this, is being developed over the next 5 years, but has been developed over the last 10 years, it being fed into those processes as quickly as possible is really important.
Can I add like one thing, small thing, where it's good to know what will happen, but we need to also prepare a policy that we don't exactly know what's going to happen, right? We have really great models and we can predict a lot, but I think we also have to put in this, space for uncertainty, where we can try to go a certain direction, but it might go completely the other direction because it's nature, right? But that's also what makes it beautiful. And if we can appreciate that for what it is, then I think there would be a lot more space in policy as well to just let it be what it is.
Thank you. Okay, we've got room for one more question in the room. Go down to the front.
Yeah, just a question to Leanne. You ended up with asking if we could find if we had ideas for a delegated structure for an OECM. Could you also consider making an active structure or a wind farm an OECM, and then make sure that you manage it the right way until the end, and also decommission it in the way that would be most valuable for conserving the biodiversity that has developed over time?
I apologize, I rushed through my last slide. It was very explicit about ongoing human activities. So it's highly unlikely it would be able to go through as an operating wind farm now, understanding all the environmental impacts that are happening at the moment during an operational wind farm. But there's no reason to suggest that you plan for end of lifetime and say, should anything, I'm not sure the legislation around offshore wind farm removal, I apologize, but if anything is left in place, maybe there's something that could be built around that. You'd take decades to build the case. But an operational wind farm, it would be highly unlikely, as it would an operational oil platform as well. Got to make sure that it's, and that's the really key, is making sure it is effective, that human activities are minimized as much as possible. But, yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for a very good question leading on to the next session, Ahmed. Yes, so thank you, everyone. We're going to move into a break now for 30 minutes back up in the poster room. And then we'll be joining back here for the next session at 11:45. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the speakers.
Is it really cold in here?
It's so cold.